Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Optimizing the Pharma Supply Chain to Drive Sustainability, Cost Efficiency, and Social Impact. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and it's going to be a lively roundtable discussion. This presentation also includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming for those who register on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Markin, a UPS company, who developed the content for this presentation. Markin is the clinical and advanced therapy subsidiary of UPS Healthcare, offering a GMP-compliant depot network and logistics hubs for clinical drug product storage and distribution in 50 locations worldwide. Markin leads in direct-to-patient services, biological sample shipments, and kit production. Services like advanced therapy supply chain, ancillary material sourcing, shipment lane verification, reverse logistics, and GDP consultancy solidify Markin's unique industry position. Their 2,600 plus staff manage 200,000 monthly shipments in more than 220 countries and have earned the 2024 Silver EcoVadis medal in recognition of their commitment to sustainability. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event. And unfortunately, I just have to make this announcement that Dion Baker, the Director of Sustainability at Markin, will not be presenting here today. So we apologize for that. But stepping in to fill in her shoes is Sandra Voss, who joined Markin in 2012 as a project manager of clinical trial logistics, and she'll do her best to try to fill in. So thank you very much for that, Sandra. Since this time, Sandra has managed multiple global clinical trial projects and collected leadership experience in director roles across direct-to-patient services, project management, and personalized medicines. She supports additional functions within Markin, including sustainability, business development, and quality assurance. So there is Sandra. And next is Esmeralda Fakin. She is a lead consultant at All Chiefs with nearly a decade of experience in international people and organization consulting projects. And there she is. Hi, Esmeralda. With a background in tax law and a passion for translating complex matters into comprehensible content, she developed her interest for ESG. And next, I'd like to introduce you to Andre Anama. He is the co-owner of All Chiefs and co-leader of the Sustainable Logistic Practice since 2019. Hi there, Andre. Prior to All Chiefs, he worked with McKinsey and Company in their global strategy and corporate finance practice. Andre has more than 25 years of experience advising clients across all major industry sectors on strategy, finance, and transactions and partnerships with a specific focus on sustainable logistics in the last 5 years. So with all of the introductions out of the way, it is now my pleasure to pass the mic over to Andre to begin this great presentation. So Andre, when you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you, Sonia. And thank you also to Marken for the opportunity to co-host this webinar today on sustainability in the supply chain. Maybe if we go to the first page, Sonia, there is substantial research that indicates that companies that lead on good environmental, social, and governance practices can actually create quite some value for their stakeholders. And studies have shown that strong performance on E, S, and G is often associated with better financial outcomes, improved risk management, increased investor trust. When one of these dimensions lags behind and is not sufficiently present, value creation can be impaired, and companies may risk, for example, losing their social license to operate. For example, when working conditions are unfair or the well-being of their communities is impacted. Companies may not be sufficiently environmentally resilient, or the company may lose its trust with its stakeholders due to inconsistent governance practices or not being compliant with regulations. So really, to create that long-term value, it's important that companies commit to each of these areas, and an increasing number of companies are making such commitments, and they're also communicating those commitments to the outside world. Some of these companies may be highly purpose-driven, whereas others may simply focus more on being compliant with regulation. But either way, making those commitments is a great start, but then a journey truly starts. And this journey most of the time will bring a lot of challenges. Just some examples, right? How do you make sure that all the right intentions that you have actually result in changing behaviors? And this could be, for example, intentions on diversity and inclusion. How do you make sure that people change their behavior? How do you ensure that you build the right in-house know-how and capabilities? So, for example, when it comes to being able to calculate your environmental impact. Also very important, how do you engage with your suppliers? How do you get them to also change with you? And how do you make sure you also have the right internal alignment within your own organizations, and that people understand the cost and benefit trade-off that you have to make in many of these areas? And finally, how do you get your customers on board? How do you actually make them also change with you? So in today's session, we will address some of these challenges that you will most likely face when making the supply chain more environmentally sustainable, and also what it actually takes to affect the change in the social and the governance domains of ESG. But maybe let's just start with the environmental pillar, and let's kind of kick this up through a quick poll. So Sonja, would you mind launching the poll, please?
It will be my pleasure, and here we go. Okay, so everyone should see the blue screen take over, and there's a poll question right there, and the question is, what share of supply chain emissions do companies report? Now, this is done in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. And I'll give you about 45 seconds to complete this simple poll. So you have a couple of options below to choose from, and you can select either any of them that relates to you. Is it 5% you believe, or is it 15%, or 40%, or the final option, 60%? So please go ahead and make your selection. Oh, this is great, Andre. We look like we have the majority of our audience have cast their votes, so this is fantastic. And if I can just encourage the rest of our audience just to submit their poll answer now, that'd be greatly appreciated. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in our first poll. I'm now going to close the polls, and let's take a quick look at the results. Okay, so here are the results. In our audience, 6% said 5%, while 44% of our audience said 15%, then 38% said 40%, and then 13% said 60%. So the question is, what is the right answer? Andre?
Thanks, Sonja. That's actually very good to see. It's we have a slightly more optimistic group of participants today, I think, which is great. We need optimism. The answer is actually surprisingly 5% of the companies. So in this case, answer A, which is very low. And maybe let me explain that a bit, where that number is coming from. And this is actually from some recent work and research published by CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, a place where a lot of companies submit all their environmental and emission data. And they've done some analysis on 2,000 of the larger companies. And it turns out about 5% of them are able to really report on their complete supply chain. Now, supply chain emissions, most of you will, I think, be very much aware of that, are generally a lot higher than the company's own operational emissions. So on average, across all the companies and sectors, supply chain emissions or scope 3 emissions are generally 26 times in the size of the company's own operational or scope 1 emissions. And the research, as I said, has shown that on average, companies are able to report on just about 5% of their supply chain emissions, of their scope 3 emission, which is very, very low. For healthcare and pharma specifically, actually the supply chain emissions are not as high. It's like 14 times the own operational, but it's still the same issue. Also there, up to about 5% of the companies are able to actually report on their full supply chain emissions. So if that's also true for you and you have difficulty in getting a complete perspective on all of your supply chain emissions, then you are certainly not alone. There are many, many companies that struggle in providing that full perspective. Now, thank you for already moving to the slide. There are indeed many different ways to kind of work on emission reduction in the supply chain in general. You know, as it shows here on the top right, it starts very often with looking for efficiencies. So ways that actually operational improvements that help you to lower the demand, for example, for transport. There's also replace, where you can replace certain assets, replace a technology, replace a fuel. There is remove, that's typically, I think, relevant for when it gets more to agricultural related environmental impact in the supply chain, but it could also be carbon removal technologies. And those are all actions that companies can take in their own operations. But it's also very important, and it shows you on the left-hand side, is to actually collaborate and innovate. And we, as Allseas, we work with our clients, different parties in the supply chain, asset owners, service providers, shippers. And in conversations with our clients, we often emphasize the need for, on the one hand, building alignment on all of these challenges within the organization, but also to really make sure that they collaborate with their suppliers, with other companies, in order to be able to have impact. So that left-hand side of the picture here, where it emphasizes ongoing collaboration and innovation, is actually very important. Now, when it comes to lowering the emissions from logistics, that we're going to focus specifically on for the next few minutes, we get questions on a number of topics. On biofuels, so how can you actually benefit from biofuels? Are they truly sustainable? Does it expose you to reputation risk? About modal switches, so what are some of the bottlenecks of getting a switch in modality, for example, from air to road or from air to ocean? How do you make that happen? When it comes to optimization of your logistics, how do you actually get that done? But also, how do you get the impact of sustainable packaging? And then finally, also electric vehicles, a very hot topic. A lot of companies experience a lot of obstacles in the deployment of electric vehicles, and there's a lot of uncertainty or unclarity of how to get the impact from that. So maybe let's just focus on some of these topics, and just starting with biofuels. And maybe, Sonia, if you could launch the next poll.
Okay, and here we go with our second poll question, and here it goes. Okay, there you go, everyone. So is it 2 kilograms at 24%, 4 kilograms at 49%, or is it 6 kilograms at 73%, or is it 7 kilograms at 85%? So please go ahead, everyone, and make your selection now, and I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. Okay, looks like we got everyone jumping on board. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds here. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in poll question number 2. And let's take a look at the results. Okay, so this is what our audience chose. So Andre, we had 14% of our audience that said 2 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 24%, while 57% of our audience chose 4 kilograms of carbon emissions at 49%. Then we got 21% saying 6 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 73%. And then finally, only 7% of our audience chose 7 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 85%. So Andre, what are your thoughts on that?
It seems that the audience has gone from optimistic to being now a little bit more pessimistic on the potential impact on biofuels. So actually, the answer that we were looking for in this case was D. It can be an impact of at least 85%. So a great impact possible from biofuel. In this case, right, we were talking about ground shipments, so it's the use of HVO. For road transport. So maybe if we can go to the next page, Sonia, which shows a little bit more the example of the shipment from Amsterdam to Paris by road, right? So an 85% reduction in the use of HVO. So that is significant, and there's huge impact to be found there. Now, the question, of course, is, how do you get that done, or what are some of the considerations there? And maybe an interesting example also to contrast to this one. We had one of our clients who really wanted to commit to the impact of biofuel in their roadmap for emission reduction for their main haul operations, and they actually want to do it both in ocean and road, but they started with ocean. And what they did is that they consolidated the majority of their ocean freight with one major supplier, so that they actually moved it to a supplier that it was in the position that had the maturity also to be able to offer biofuel at scale. And they truly committed to that supplier for using biofuel, so giving a real incentive to the supplier to be able to actually execute on it. And that actually together give them into a position that they've been really able to set up an effective partnership for biofuel deployment in ocean transport, ultimately actually impacting the majority of the ocean transport for our clients and reducing the overall emissions from their ocean freight by 70%. So huge impact. But again, it does require working together with your supplier, making sure you have the right conditions in place and finding ways to partner with them. When it comes to the deployment of biofuels, it's also important to be aware of some of the biofuel specific topics that you also see here on the bottom right, which is around the feedstock being used. So is it truly sustainable feedstock, typically used fats or waste, for example, but also making sure that is the right kind of certification around the biofuel, so that you are really certain that you get what you're buying. And when your biofuel strategy is built around book and claim solutions, there's a set of other issues around the registration of those environmental benefits that are being transferred between partners, and really validation of the claimed impact, right? So some very specific issues to be taken care of, but it does offer a lot of potential for emission reduction. So Sandra, I think that you've also been looking at the benefits of biofuels to your customers. What are some of the steps that you've taken as Marken?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Andre, and it's really a good question. And before I jump into the answer right away, I would like to provide some background information about Marken. So, you know, Marken operates on an asset-light business model. So that means we do not own most of the vehicles in our network, and therefore we cannot directly enforce, let's say, for example, replacement of fossil fuel by biofuel, or replacement of a gasoline car by electric vehicles, right? So really the most meaningful assets in this case are those of our network partners. So we needed to find a way of collaborating in the supply chain to even start creating that appetite for change. And yeah, as you can probably imagine, Andre, the sustainability maturity level across our large and diverse road carrier network highly varies, right? So you have a small number of network partners that are already able to sell you road insets, right? The reductions directly because they have established a system and have the certification in place. But the larger number of carriers don't have a solution yet, right? Some don't really have access to the type of biofuel we would like them to source. And of course, there are many in between of these categories, right? So we needed to start working through many individual setups and situations to help creating that demand for biofuel. And that's exactly what we did in our biofuel pilot project earlier this year.
And could you tell us a little bit more what then you did in that pilot? Because it's certainly, I understand the challenges that you just mentioned. So what did you find out when you started to do that pilot?
Yeah, yes, of course. So we conducted that pilot project over a duration of 3 months earlier this year with some of our road carriers, airlines, and also strategic clients. So in collaboration, we successfully reduced our joint Scope 3 transportation emissions on road and on air. So that said, of course, sustainable aviation fuel, also known as SAF, was of course also part of our pilot project. And now when we compare the implementation of road biofuels with sustainable aviation fuel, what is important to mention is that while on the road side, you know, we ask our carriers to replace the fuel, right? So they go to the pump and instead of fueling fossil diesel, they fuel, let's say, for example, hydrotreated vegetable oil, so HVO 100 as an alternative. So the impact on our end will be the price difference, right? But that's not how it works on the sustainable aviation fuel side today, because there our shipments are booked and paid as usual, but instead we will buy the reductions from the airlines, right? Because that's just the state of the market today. So we are here speaking about the different asset types, so not about the fuel, but really SAF credits, if you wish, and also different cost type. Yeah, when we now think of the fact that the majority of our emissions originate from air freight, that's of course really another dimension of adaptation and change that we'll have to consider. Nevertheless, I think it's really important to start creating these partnerships while we are, of course, looking into other reduction solutions that, however, are not as scalable today, or some of them requiring new technologies on the horizon to be implemented, right? So overall, it was a very insightful experience with many lessons learned and findings. And yes, of course, we will continue to provide the opportunity to our clients to join the program and benefit from the advantage of joint reductions towards our goals and targets. And before I hand back over, there's one other specific point I wanted to mention or highlight specifically as a lessons learned here. I know when we speak about implementing these reduction projects, we're all looking for high impact project, right? So we focus on the large suppliers because they make up a big portion of our carbon footprint. But what we really realized quickly in our project is that oftentimes it's the small partners, the small ones, that are more open towards change, that bring ideas to the table and really open to try something new. So while, of course, eventually we need to work together with all of our suppliers in the supply chain, I think it's very important to keep the door open early in the journey for that small partners, right? They do not create the impact in that sense, but really bring ideas and help you to identify lessons learned or new ways of doing things. So that's what I wanted to highlight specifically in that context too.
Great. Thank you very much. I think it's great that you did this pilot and to really learn about what it actually takes, not only for you to execute this, but also to meet your customer demand. I think it's a great example. So Sonia, maybe we can move to the third and I think the final poll in this section, but to move us on to the next topic.
Okay, and I'm going to, that question was, how much CO2e is saved using consolidated ground transport instead of air freight from Amsterdam to Paris, averaging 20 kilograms CO2 emissions? And we had 4 options below for our audience attendants to choose from. One was 2.5 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 13%, 8.6 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 43%, and 11.9 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 60%. And then finally, 5.2 kilograms of carbon emissions, or 76%. And as you see here, or as I'm going to say, the results here are 9% for that 2.5 kilograms. Then we had 55% of our audience chose the 8.6 kilograms. And then we have a tie here for 18% for both 11.9 kilograms and 18% again for 15.2 kilograms. So thank you everyone for participating in our final poll question. And now back to Andre to find out his thoughts on the results from our audience and what is the correct answer. Andre?
Great. Thank you. Well, from going to optimistic to pessimistic, I think we're now a little bit more balanced, which is wonderful. It's very close to, I think, in the example we have here, where it is 60%. But let me explain a little bit more on that.
Okay.
But I think all of you, indeed, most of you saw that there's significant reduction potential from this. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So air transport is, of course, very polluting, right? It's a lot of emission coming from that, and even more so on very short distance. Now, in this example, where it goes from a European flight to a European freight transport, actually the 60% reduction, for some of you who may have looked at this, some of you actually indicated that it still is a little bit modest. So that also shows that there's not always an immediate obvious answer, because the alternative here, the road transport, because it's time critical road freight, it means that it is probably a vehicle which is not fully loaded. So for road freight specifically, it is a relatively higher emitting road freight option, but still it's a significant reduction to air freight, and it shows the potential that may be there for some air shipments, especially within Europe, where this particular road freight option is certainly still very acceptable from a kind of logistical performance point of view in terms of being time critical enough and so on, right? So if there are opportunities to reduce air freight and move it into road or another modality, that is hugely impactful from emission point of view. It can actually also even reduce, obviously, the logistics cost, and you have two benefits. We have numerous, I think, examples from our client work where our clients try to do this. Maybe I'll just kind of focus on one or two quickly, right? Because what this typically links to is really discussions on lead time, or other operational constraints like pickup time at a supplier or a customer, for example. So there's usually operational challenges of getting a change in modality executed and done right. We, for example, have one of our clients is a global fashion company, and what they end up doing was really reviewing their ordering process to their manufacturers, who are mostly in Southeast Asia, and to try to kind of really adjust the ordering process in order to create enough time in the kind of total timeline to be able to then move from air into other modalities. And that is an example of what it takes. You have to approach your operations maybe in a different way. And we see that a lot of the time, to be able to do this, it actually requires coordination with other stakeholders. And that could be internally around, production planning, but it could also mean coordination with your customers to adjust indeed, pickup or delivery times, for example. And it might actually also have, implications for how you mention inventory. If it means that a change of modality creates longer lead times, it may kind of come at the expense of some higher inventory levels. But it's important to really kind of look at all of this as a whole and see how can you create a net a positive impact on emissions, ideally also with a lower total cost for the business. Now, I know that I think, Sandra, that Dee mentioned before that as Marken, you have also worked with your customers looking into switches in modalities. Do you know what some of the challenges are that you've encountered as Marken when you try to do this with your customers?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Andre. So indeed, so what we found out very early in the process is that the most critical step essentially is to be able to identify viable reduction strategies to understand our network emissions, right? And really see where do the emissions come from and how does it relate to the distance of shipments, to be able to even analyze these kind of switches. So that's what we did in 2022, where we really did a detailed analysis of our network. And so we were able to say, well, there's a small portion of emissions, like roughly 15% originating from road transportation. And the bigger portion, 85% originating from air transportation. And then we were also able to break down further the road transportation into and air transportation into short haul flights, or medium haul and long haul, right? And I mean, on top of the fact that most of our air transportation is happening on medium and long haul flights, we mainly ship clinical trial related medicines, materials, right? So really the largest portion of our shipments is time sensitive and temperature sensitive shipments. So we have to kind of move within this set of requirements in order to make a decision. Is a modal switch from air to road appropriate? Will we still meet the shipment requirements? Or is that something that is not working in this case, right? So yes, we are looking into these options, but really what has to happen is that we work together with that individual client based on their individual footprint with Marken and the lanes that they have in place to see where is the potential for which type of shipment to move lanes. And I will tell you that at the end of the day, based on the challenges or let's say the situation that I described, there are in many cases not a lot of opportunities to switch modes and really make a significant reduction with that, right? However, what we were able to look into is more on the internal side when we have to move packaging stocks, for example, from between regions or countries. We were able to find a way to move these packaging movements to ocean freight, right? So that's something we are looking into beyond the client-facing projects, and this is really where we can also see some progress made and some really big impact, because of course it's a difference if you ship 50 tons of freight via air freight versus via ocean freight, right? So that's really something we are looking at internally, and on the client-facing side. That's the detailed analysis that has to happen first in order to identify potential.
No, I think that's great, and we see it a lot. It's very specific discussions with customers to understand what are the really kind of the hard constraints that make it impossible versus what are the situations where you do indeed find opportunities to make some changes. And of course, in addition to the to modality change, there's other kind of opportunities that to kind of optimize, right? So whether it's the way you plan, it's about trying to consolidate shipments, maybe between customers, right? Or in other ways. And we have a lot of discussion with our clients also on that. I think one thing that we see that a lot of our clients are not really, I think, fully looking into or understanding is sustainable packaging. We do have one client in fashion who is seriously looking into this, both from a materials perspective, so the packaging itself, but also I think from the impact on literally how much air is in the package, to avoid that they just are transporting literally air, right? Because it's clothing, it's apparel, it's not very dense. But often we find this is an area that is not yet fully kind of looked into. What do you do when it comes to sustainable packaging? Because I understand this is also an area where you have really looked into.
Yeah, indeed. And I have to say, on our end, it's a really famous topic, actually, on the client side, but also on the supplier side. And of course, certainly one of the key challenges is calculating emissions associated with packaging materials, right? Because you're then not only looking at emissions originating from the production, but you would want to understand the entire life cycle emissions, right, from the raw materials to disposal or reuse. So I guess this is where we're on a similar situation like on the transportation side, where we receive supplier data from many different suppliers that we need to somehow make comparable, right, to compare different packaging options against each other. And additionally, I will say we often end up in a conversation about the dilemma of how to weigh for example, the positive environmental impact of reducing waste with one packaging option that on the other end increases the emissions because it's reusable and has to be shipped back, right? So it's really striking that balance between environmental benefits and operational trade-offs is complex and requires careful consideration. And go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, how are we addressing these challenges at Marken? We really have started to work very closely together with our suppliers to obtain so-called life cycle assessments that will allow us to understand and analyze the environmental impact of the packaging across its entire life cycle, right? So these findings from these assessments can also then be used to refine packaging designs in a collaborative approach and to adjust logistics strategies, right? So you can ensure that the overall environmental impact still remains positive. So in the case of replacing a single-use packaging, for example, by a reusable packaging because you would like to avoid waste or reduce waste. Of course, at the same time, then we have to optimize the packaging placements and return logistics through a closed loop system to improve resource efficiency and then contribute to the overall positive impact. And Yeah, I mean, another important conversation that we keep on having with clients is about the different impact categories, right? So you could, for example, you could say we purely look at emissions per use, or we want to focus more on product materials, or look at land use impacts, right? And you will probably not find a packaging solution that equally addresses all these impact categories. So what you'll want to do is, based on your company specific targets and priorities, assign severity factors to these criteria to allow for consistent decision making when it comes to sustainable packaging solutions. And I personally really see the biggest lever in collaboration between suppliers, logistics providers, and customers, because especially in that clinical trial related context, it's so hard to conduct packaging pilots simply because the stringent requirements from a regulatory and product perspective that have to be met, right? So I think only if we find a way of sharing insights, resources, costs, and ideas, this is where we can drive collective responsibility and increase the impact overall.
Right. Great. I think it's great that also what you describe in terms of the trade-off between the various elements, and that's something I think I also recognize in general in logistics, about different trade-offs in terms of performance versus cost versus environmental impact. And I think this also mirrors here. There are different elements to this, and you can't optimize on every dimension, right? It's always about making trade-offs and see what's the best possible solution for yourself or for a client. Great. So maybe then also in the interest of time, let's kind of look at the final topic, and I think we can go through this a bit more quickly. This was on electric vehicles. As I mentioned before, it's a topic that I think gets a lot of attention right now, and for all the right reasons. But we find that also many of the companies that we work with really struggle with how to make this a reality. Mostly because it often comes again, like modality changes, with a lot of operational complexities. But in this case, more related to this kind of change in technology, if you'd like, right? So whether it's around the range limitations of electric vehicles, the fact that you certainly have to take charging time also into account, whether or not there is sufficient infrastructure to actually charge the vehicles, right? These are operational complexities that make the deployment or the introduction of electric vehicles in the supply chain quite challenging. But that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities right now to do so, because there certainly are. But it actually means most of the time, and I think similar, Sandra, to what you also done with piloting on biofuels, right? It actually also takes piloting on electric vehicles to see what it actually takes to introduce this into your supply chain. And what it means operationally, or what are some of the kind of changes you have to make in your internal processes to facilitate this. A lot of companies that we've worked with, I think the leading ones on logistics sustainability are definitely pushing into electric vehicles. They're doing pilots themselves, by themselves. I think it's also important to look for pilots maybe with other companies. There are some sector-wide pilot programs that are kind of interesting, and they're mentioned here on the right-hand side. And Smart Freight Center also has a coalition around this with CalStart. But it's also a possibility to start partnering with suppliers or other partners in the supply chain and kind of pilot together around electric vehicles and actually learn from other companies as well, right? So I think it's important to do that. And yeah, we believe that the companies who are really leading and who want to be successful in making the supply chain sustainable, especially if you have road freight, that's starting to piloting right now and starting to learn is really necessary to position yourself well for the scale up of this technology that is really going to come, and make sure you're truly prepared for being able to successfully execute the scale up. Now, I know that you've also have experienced and with EVs in your network. I'm not sure, Sandra, if you're positioned to kind of talk about this, and also in the interest of time, whether we want to do that, or is there something you'd like to share here, or very briefly?
Yeah, this is also a kind of more collaborative effort on our end, right, Andre? And I think we spoke about the breakdown of our transportation, right, and really assessed that only a very small portion of short-haul shipments on road would qualify for that solution. But we are certainly working together with some of our network partners, and we engaged in a successful pilot earlier this year, and are really trying to scale up collaborative projects in this space on the client side and supplier side. But you are right. In the interest of time, I would love to hand over to Esmeralda to give some more insights on the social and governance side too,
Yes.
which is equally important part of sustainability.
I fully agree. So let's do that. And Sonia, could you skip forward to the social section, please? And then I'm going to hand it over to Esmeralda.
Thanks a lot, Andre and Sandra. I think, Andre, you fairly mentioned it at the very beginning of this webinar, that one of the critical aspects of sustainability is also the social pillar of ESG. And as we focus on optimizing the pharmaceutical supply chain today, it's very important that we all have in our minds that the choices we make don't just affect our environmental footprints. They also shape the communities we serve, but also the people that work within our own organizations. And the pharmaceutical industry has a very large and global reach, and also has a very important role in the whole healthcare section. And thereby they are so good positioned with a unique opportunity to lead by example. And by embedding the social impact into the whole supply chain strategies, you can really drive meaningful change while still achieving also the sustainability and cost efficiency goals. And I think that that's a combination that a lot of companies are looking to. How can we achieve this? And in this segment where we are talking about the social pillar of ESG, there is a lot to talk about, but I'll focus today on two specific elements, the diverse supplier spend and D&I, whereby I will share some real practical examples that we have seen. So let me start with the first topic. We can go one back, please, Sonia. Thanks. Which is diverse supplier spend. And I think, Sandra, you mentioned it fairly also at the beginning, that some smaller companies and suppliers are so much open to change and willing to contribute. And we should see how we can actually empower that and implement it in our own company's processes. Because supporting the diverse suppliers is not just about being compliant or the spending quotas, even though that is something that is pretty important, of course, also from a procurement perspective. But it's also about creating this positive social ripple effect. So by prioritizing diverse supplier spend, pharmaceutical companies foster a healthier and more resilient society. And that fully aligns with the industry's purpose, like improving human health and well-being. So let me share some very practical ways that companies can make diverse supplier partnerships a meaningful part of their own operations. And this could start by setting clear targets and reporting, just as companies do for other ESG goals, such as the emissions that we just saw. So for example, we can include tracking of the percentage of the total procurement spend directed to the diverse suppliers, and also report on the progress that you see here. Another thing is that you can make sure that you have a very inclusive vendor qualification processes. So companies can review their internal processes to identify and where needed, remove some barriers that might unintentionally actually exclude diverse suppliers. And by broadening the criteria, you might open up your view for some new suppliers, and you open some new doors for the suppliers who might not have been considered otherwise. So yeah, I think that those are like easy steps that that a lot of companies can make to see how they can make an impact here. And I would also like to share with you a real practical example from a major player in the pharma industry who actually integrated diverse supplier investment initiatives into their global procurement strategy. And they have various elements included in there, such as a diverse supplier development program. They partner with organizations supporting underrepresented groups to make sure that they are able to locate and qualify the diverse suppliers. Another thing that they do is that they provide mentorship and training and some business development resources to the diverse suppliers because they are so eager, as mentioned earlier, to help them and support them to meet the regulatory standards and operate effectively in the pharmaceutical supply chain, also making them a more attractive and a better fit for your company to start working with them. Another thing that this company has done is they have modified the whole vendor qualification process, whereby they included some evaluation criteria that emphasize the diversity and inclusion to ensure that the diverse suppliers are given equal consideration in the procurement decisions that are being made. And I fully recognize in practice that not every company might be able to quickly adopt all these initiatives that I've just mentioned, but perhaps our participants see some low-hanging fruits in their own organization based on what I've just told, and that they can really start with as per today, basically. And besides the diverse supplier spend, I would like to take it to DE&I, which is also a topic that we see companies starting with as part of their social impact strategy. But I get some questions in practice here and there, like, how can we do this? This is quite challenging because there are some different privacy regulations, such as GDPR that is initiated in the EU, but also local privacy rules in other countries. And I have some practical tips here and there that could help in getting things started. You don't have to be go from 0 to 100% in one go. But you could, for example, go from combining global and local approaches because many companies have a global D&I framework and they adapt it per country based on the local regulations. So in some countries, they can collect some more detailed statistics, while in others, they remain more general. And in practice, we see that this is a very good starting point that could be amended over time. So that works very well, and a lot of companies have adopted that. But another option is anonymized and aggregated data. So companies do collect the data on DE&I, but in such a way that individual employees cannot be identified. And another solution could be just asking your people for voluntary participation. Just offer them the option to voluntarily participate in D&I surveys to collect the data on this topic, or not report qualitative at all, but just bring across in the company stories about inclusion initiatives, leadership development programs for the underrepresented groups that they might have, or any other examples that could be a great starting point for enhancing some new initiatives from a D&I perspective. So Sandra, I am well aware of the time and that there might be some examples from these perspectives from both elements in the social pillar that Marken is also is working with. Could you share any examples here today?
Well, first of all, thank you for the examples you provided. I think that was really insightful, and really agree also on your comments on the diverse supplier span of tracking and making diverse suppliers visible. And I think the most important final step is really then also to commit to diverse supplier spend, right? Because of course, if the suppliers are smaller, they will probably not be competitive in pricing. So I think that's kind of the final mile that companies really need to start going to in that regards. Yeah, I have indeed another example from one of our clients that asked us to collaborate on their fair chance employment program, right? So, which is a really nice example of sharing resources, because they were asking us if we could share the agencies to get access to these resources if we start employing people for the positions related to that client's business with us, right? So that I think that's really something new that we have seen coming up, but just one example of what we can all do in this space. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for sharing that, Sandra. Considering time, can we move one slide, Sonja, to the governance pillar, the final pillar of ESG, whereby I would really like to share a really tangible example on how governance can improve effectiveness of ESG initiatives in the companies of our participants of today. So I want to share an example of a large software company, not the same sector, but they introduced ESG-related KPIs into, for example, executive bonuses, which could motivate leaders to drive the initiatives. It could be really supporting backbone. And they, for example, included on the carbon emissions, like we need to have reductions in scope 1, 2, and 3, aiming for the net zero goals, and really attach all those leaders to and get them motivated to drive those initiatives, but also on diversity and inclusion that I just mentioned. If we have tangible targets on the progress in the workforce representation targets that we can have, such as increasing the diverse hires that we see within the company, this is also a great thing, how leaders can support such initiatives. And considerative of time, I think from here, Sonja, can we move on to the Q&A?
Okay, we have time for just one question. I just want to say thank you very much for that great presentation, first of all. Thank you very much for that. And we'll jump right into the Q&A. And just remember, audience members, that if we did not attend to your questions, that the team at Marken will follow up with you after this presentation. So let's go to this first question here. What do you consider the primary ESG challenges faced by the pharmaceutical logistics industry? Who would like to tackle that one? Is that a Sandra, Esmeralda, or Andre question?
I can certainly, I think, well, come from the E, right? So a perspective, maybe this as a starter, right? And there I think that what I can see as a primary challenge is that you know, there are some very specific requirements in the industry, whether it's about the time, right? So kind of critical time freight, around the kind of safety, all the regulation around this, right? Which can be a real, not necessarily limiting factor in changing things, but it just makes it more challenging, right? So when I come from an environmental point of view and trying to reduce the impact of emissions, I think that is a big challenge, right? These regulations are there for a reason, like especially in the case of Marken with some of the samples and the that need to kind of go to labs, right? There is very limited time, and that just means that you just have limited options sometimes to change your operations. You can still use biofuel, but that's going to come with costs. So there's a huge discussion on, how do we make sure that those costs get shared and people start to understand that, that is what it's going to take to make the, let's say, the supply chain more environmentally, or let's say lower the environmental impact of the supply chain.
Okay. Anything else from Esmeralda or Sandra to add to that answer?
Yeah, I think, Andre, you're certainly right. It's the type of business, of shipments that we move. It's the number of players involved in the supply chains, certainly. And also, of course, if you want to truly implement activities and work streams, it's cost and resources, right? Because you have to plan your programs, you have to execute them, you need resources. It's more than just sending out a newsletter once a month, right? So it's really making an investment in not just with money, but also on resources and time to create some tangible results. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think that's it. Esmeralda, anything from you, or we're good with everyone's answers?
I'm very good with everyone's answer. Thanks, Sonia, for checking.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for those answers. We have reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar, so thank you, Andre, Esmeralda, and Sandra. If we couldn't attend to your questions, remember the team at Markin will follow up with you after this presentation. And if you have any further questions, please direct them to the email address that you see there on your screen. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. And give me a few seconds, I will be sharing a link to view the recording of today's event in the chat box, which you can also share with your colleagues once they register for the recording here as well. And now I'm going to thank our speakers again, Sandra, Esmeralda, and Andre, for their great presentation and their time here for us today, and Sandra for filling in on the late notice. So thank you very much for that. We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Bye, everyone. Bye, Andre, Sandra, Esmeralda. Bye, everyone. Thank you.